Communication technologies have not only opened up our world socially, but economically as well. This is significant for the business-minded within our country because not only do ICTs transform the ways in which we operate, but they can open up our markets beyond our borders as well. How often do we hear Botswana decry the fact that our small population hinders their growth? With the right product and innovative marketing, we can now hope to sell products and solutions to people all over the country and the world through e-commerce. And with the right legislation in place, legitimate contracts and agreements can be forged by entrepreneurs on opposite sides of the globe. According to the Boston Consulting Group, the global leaders in e-commerce are the UK, with an internet economy that is growing at a rate of 10.9%, and that is expected to contribute £225 billion to the overall economy by 2016, more than healthcare, construction, or education. Our own government has spent millions of pula on ICT infrastructure, generous amounts of time crafting the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, the Electronic Records Evidence Act, policy documents that will govern the operations of online companies, as well as protect the consumer online. These acts now need working regulations and guidelines for them to be put to use, and the Botswana Communications Regulatory Authority, BOCRA, recently held a public consultation workshop to refine said regulations. Focus was on the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, passed just last year, which covers areas such as legality of electronic contracts and transactions, secure electronic signatures, consumer protections, and guidelines for online marketing. Tsoganetso Kepaletswe, Deputy Chief Executive Officer at BOCRA, has more to say about the objectives of this workshop.
The main aim of the public consultation workshop really was to engage the stakeholders in terms of the Electronic Communication and Transaction Act, which was passed by Parliament last year. That act, its main objective is basically to facilitate the e-commerce, things like online shopping. So really those are the main objective of that act. Now in that act there are provisions basically for BOCRA to make sure that we accreditate people or companies which will produce what is called digital signatures. The digital signatures is a replacement of a normal signature which somebody have, but in the electronic world, where when you make a transaction or you make a communication, in order to make sure that is secure, there is what is called a digital signature, which you can have as a consumer, and it will be linked to your consumer device so that you are able to sign using that signature and will be able to say this communication or this transaction was done by this person because the signature is coming from that person. So really that was the whole objective, was to consult the stakeholders on those regulations and guidelines.
What steps are to be taken after this consultation?
After we have consulted the stakeholders and finalized the regulations, those regulations will be passed to the Attorney General so that the Minister now pass them as final regulations, which will be accompanying the Electronic Transaction Act. And now the Electronic Communication Transaction Act will be put in force, and now people will be able to actually, when they transact, they will be able to get signatures, because we'll use those regulations to accredit companies which will produce the digital signatures in Botswana, so that you can have your own digital signature and you can use them for transaction.
How soon can we expect to see results and to facilitate e-commerce?
Before the beginning of this financial year, the regulations on our side, they should be finished. We will be passing them to Attorney General. We expect the Attorney General to expedite the process, because this is a law which most of the industry has been waiting, because it is actually critical that we have that those regulations in place.
Next on the program, we sit down with the international consultants hired to help draft the regulations that will help facilitate e-commerce in Botswana. Welcome back as we discuss the drafting of e-commerce regulations in Botswana. Our first guest is Bernard Malia, who is CEO of Equinox Advisory and also the president of the Institute for the Research and Improvement of Social Sciences, the vice president of the Mediterranean Institute of Innovation, Communications and Technology, and a visiting lecturer at the University of Malta. He is one of the Maltese consultants who facilitated the recent public consultation on the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act hosted by BOCRA. He speaks to us about the ways in which e-commerce could enhance Botswana's economic performance.
Well, there are many ways in which electronic commerce can help Botswana in growing economically and socially. I think that given the experience of other countries who have actually implemented e-commerce frameworks and e-commerce legislations, there is a very good chance that if Botswana had to emulate the successes of these other countries, it would be better able to integrate within the world economy and therefore to be able to provide its citizens with a better standard of living. Basically, if we had to try to see what the basic principles of electronic commerce are, one would see that even if one had to look at Botswana's current economy is very based on resource extraction. So you've got diamonds, which amount for the preponderance of Botswana's wealth, and you've got gold and copper and nickel as well, which are all depletable resources, and once those resources have been depleted, then Botswana needs to see what it's going to do to continue on its path to prosperity. Now, it is commendable that the Botswana government has been thinking about this from years before, so that the wealth being generated by these depletable resources is invested in an infrastructure that will enable the maintenance and the growth of the living standards of the Botswana community.
For us to see robust e-commerce activities, what systems need to be in place? This is a question we asked our guest.
There are several critical success factors when you're looking at electronic commerce, but if I had to point out which critical success factor is perhaps the most important, I would say trust in the system. And no trust can come about unless there is a regulatory framework that is strong and that sends a clear message to all those who are willing to use the electronic commerce infrastructure to be able to conduct business not only within the confines of Botswana, but outside of Botswana in the rest of the world as well.
Next on the program, the Director of Legal Services at Equinox Advisory expands on the principles of e-commerce. Welcome back to First Issues as we explore the structures necessary to foster a thriving e-commerce sector. Dr. Jackie Skerry has advised clients on all legal matters relating to information technology, telecommunications, broadcasting, data protection, intellectual property, electronic commerce, remote gaming, and internet-related issues. She expertly unpacks the principles of e-commerce.
Yes, so basically e-commerce regulation exists in order to ensure that e-commerce is taken up in a country and to give equivalence to electronic transactions and documents in the same way as one would give evidence, paper evidence or paper transactions the same kind of evidential weight. So essentially what we're trying to do by regulating electronic commerce is to ensure that an electronic transaction or an electronic record is as equivalent in terms of evidence and in terms of effectiveness as any paper document that we are traditionally used to, and traditional contracts and traditional types of records.
There are various factors at play when conducting a business electronically that are very different from transacting in the physical world. Dr. Skerry says all these must be taken into account when considering a consumer protection online.
Essentially, again, consumer legislation has been catered for in the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act to the extent that it ensures that the gap created by the distance that an electronic transaction allows is mitigated. So if you are buying online, obviously you don't have the same comfort that you would have when you're going into a shop. You don't know exactly what you are purchasing in terms of you haven't really seen the product in your hands, you haven't really seen the color, you haven't seen the size of it. So one has to ensure that the law tries to, as much as possible, mitigate this problem. And essentially what the law does is it ensures that you are able, for example, to return a product within 7 days without having to have any specific reason. So the law allows you 7 days after receiving the product to send it back if you essentially do not feel that the product is exactly what you had in mind. Furthermore, it also allows you to ensure that you know who you are dealing with, because the law requires that any service provider selling items or services from a website is including all the information necessary for the consumer to know who they are dealing with. So in terms of, for example, details, contact details, the entity or individual that is selling, VAT or any other types of taxes that would be applicable, delivery charges, all of this has to be made expressly clear on the website so that the consumer can know exactly what they are dealing with and how much their product is actually going to cost. And also, if they have an issue, who they are to contact. So the law tries to cover all these issues that come out of the fact that the consumer is not dealing anymore face-to-face, but at a distance.
That concludes the first part of our show. When we return, we look at the untapped potential of public procurement policy. Welcome back to First Issues. When one considers the state and plight of African countries and their valiant efforts to break free from poverty and instability, public procurement is often overlooked as a potentially powerful tool to implement change and further development. A sector on the forefront of increasing efficiencies and combating corruption. Global economy and development expert Jeffrey Gutman writes that too often the community sees public procurement as either administrative minutiae or as a hotbed of fraud and corruption. He says that as a result, procurement bodies either fail to engage in the development discussion at all, or they aggressively push for increased safeguards in the policies and procedures governing bid and award. There is, however, growing acknowledgement that public procurement is more than a bid and award instrument, and that its policies can be used to further citizen welfare. Jane Njoroge, the General Manager of Technical Services with Kenya's Public Procurement Oversight Authority, tells us about their inspiring year-old rural inclusion program that is accessible to even the minority members of the community and the disadvantaged.
Okay, it started when the current government came to power, and as you remember that the competition in the last general election in Kenya were very stiff, and the current president said if Kenyans vote us in unanimously and we do not go for a rerun, because in Kenya you have to get 50 plus 1% to go through a presidential election, then the money that has been kept aside by the Electoral Commission, which is 6 billion for a rerun, we will use it, but we'll send it back to Kenyans to do business with government, because we have thought that one of the reasons how we can spur economic development in this country is to be inclusive and not just use big companies, but include everybody in what we call inclusive economic development of this country. So we want every villager who is capable of doing business, and they do business at the local level, to do business with government. We want these young men who are unemployed to start doing business with government, courtesy of the revolving fund that the government will give. We want to make our disabled more active by doing business. If they have a small business which they are doing, we'll extend to them money, which they will do business and return back to us. It will go to another person, and then we do business. So when he issued that directive, then of course the next thing, the Minister for Finance quickly gazetted a new regulation and said for every public entity, a minimum of 30% of your procurement spend must go to the youth, women, and persons with disability.
Through interdepartmental cooperation and effective training initiatives, Ms. Njorege says target groups were given the confidence to take part in the inclusion program.
One way we did that is to use what we call the community youth groups, and we would get them through the Ministry of Youth, who would mobilize from each locality, put the youth into a group for us to train them. So we would have centers all over, and we ran program through the newspapers that in this coming 2 weeks we are in this county, we are in this county. And we started engaging them. Of course, they'll tell you, you ask them, you engage with them and ask them, what stops you from doing business with government? They'll tell you, one of the things we think is that if I'm competing for business, it will go to the big people. And therefore, for me, I can't win. Then you explain to them, you tell them, there is a portion set aside for you, and you cannot compete with these people. So you'll be competing, if we're talking about selling eggs to a hospital next to you, you'll be competing with your fellow farmers from the locality. So it is the same way you go to the marketplace and put your eggs there and sell. So you'll be competing amongst equal, because for this, the threshold is that you must be small and medium enterprise. If it is for women, it will appear in the papers as reserved for women, and therefore a man cannot participate. If it is said it is reserved for youth, it is for youth. So it's youth to compete amongst youth. So when they understood that concept, of course they were like, if I'm competing with whoever I know, then I can't do it. Then came the second question. Then what about these tender documents? We do not understand how bids are filled. Then we said, okay, we'll organize programs where we sit down with you. We even distribute those bid documents to you, then fill it. Then we look, where are you getting a challenge? We actually go to class and train and do practical filling of a bid document.
How successful would our guests say these seemingly straightforward solutions have been?
I will tell you that has worked. It has improved economic welfare of very many families in the rural Kenya. It has created enterprises that were never there, because some of those people would go get that money from government, say that I want to do A, B, C, D. They advance the money. You have to have a business plan. We showed them how to do it. Then you get the money. Once you get the money, we now start working with you. And every public entity in its procurement plan has to show that portion that is reserved for those groups. And they forward that plan to ourselves. And on a quarterly basis, as a regulator, we monitor. You said at the beginning of the year, you're going to give this portion to the youth, this portion to the women. Can we see how many tenders have been awarded to the women? These women are registered by the National Treasury. So their database is there. So you can't give anybody else, because they come with their certificates of registration. They are again registered by the National Treasury for the scheme, and therefore we know who they are and which category of goods they are dealing with. So that program, I'll tell you, and we have shared with our counterparts in this country, is a good program. It has worked very well. Then came the question, once I have been advanced this money and I'll return this money, then how do I progress in the future? It may be a one-time thing, and I have not generated enough money to stand alone on myself. So government introduced what we call LPO financing. LPO financing means that once you get a tender from a public entity, that public entity has an obligation to work with your financial institution, may it be a bank, to give a commitment that if so-and-so John, this is the LPO we have given him, if you advance money to John, we will pay John through your bank. And therefore, you will recoup your money after the contract is completed. So, and banks, we started talking to banks, financial institutions as government, and believe you me, many were willing to work with the government because they know that once government gives a commitment, it's as good as cash.
Jane says the innovation that is LPO Financing has been extremely beneficial for Kenyan women in particular.
It used to be a challenge that when a woman goes to the bank, you know, in our country and historically, and I believe it's most of the African countries, we do not own assets. If it's land, the title of that land belongs to my husband. If it's a car, maybe I'm driving a car, but the logbook belongs to the man. So when you go to the bank to get advanced money, they'll ask you for collateral. And when you take it, they say, this is not yours, Jane, because it belongs to somebody else. So through LPO financing, the banks were able now to dispense the money to these groups. And it has worked very well because some of them have created a relationship with banks, and now the bank knows for 2-3 times this person is coming with a different LPO, and therefore the banks have seen a market grow of potential customers created by the government.
What quantifiable results have they seen from this initiative?
The survey is on now to see the impact of the program because it is just about 1 year old in the country. But we have had testimonies because sometimes we have even barazas. The agenda is being driven by the Ministry of Devolution, which is catering for all the counties. We have had barazas of where women have come in and told us, and we have seen a woman, we've shown where she started. A woman was just doing a small cultivation in his shamba. She belongs to this group of women, how they developed this, and you are shown this is the tractor that she's now lending to the area to plow all the land around her because she has owned a tractor. And they have confessed and said, I never imagined in my life I can own a machine. I never imagined I can be an entrepreneur who is now running tractors in the rural areas, leasing them to farmers, all courtesy of this table banking, doing business with government. So we have seen results, tangible results. We have seen women who have said, I was just selling mandazis around the streets, selling flowers. Then I was called and I was told there's this program. I got the money and now I supply to government this big. And those statistics are going to be released by the Kenya government very, very soon.
We hope that this example, along with reforms seen at international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank, are a sign of things to come for the entire continent. Until next week and another issue of interest, I, Namiza Samakula, the team behind First Issues, and our sponsors, First National Bank, wish you a good night and pleasant viewing.